What is the main difference between these three models? And what makes these two look so much better than the other one? Well, it's not talent or the time spent painting them. It comes down to something entirely different, which I'm gonna show you today. Hi, I'm Zumikito and I paint miniatures for a living. It's a small job, but someone has to do it. And today, you'll discover how to transform your minis to painting like this, how you can accelerate your progress and save yourself years of trial and error. So let's talk about the first milestone which you have to cross to paint better. This miniature is from a time way before I started YouTube and before I tried to really improve. It really doesn't help that the mini itself is from fine cast resin, which is absolute garbage and you shouldn't buy it if you have plastic alternatives. But even the paint job itself is rather underwhelming, and that's putting it mildly. So what is going on here? I could point out many different things, like the lack of cleanliness, the fact that some edge highlights are so thick that they make all the girls jealous, or even that some parts are not even painted. But all of this pales in comparison to the biggest mistake that I made, which is that I had no idea what I'm doing. And everything that I mentioned is just a byproduct of my ignorance. At best, I was trying to imitate the box art picture, but that's about it. I didn't really know how to make edge highlights thin, I had no idea how to replicate a credible glow effect, and I didn't even know that I'm supposed to paint under a lamp. But worst of all, I didn't know I shouldn't buy fine cast. Man, I'm so glad they're now plastic. Well, aside from the last one, all of these could be learned from various resources online, which isn't really surprising, but how the f was I supposed to know? All I did is buy some damn Space Marines, dry brush the ever-living shit out of them, and drown them in battered black. Yes, that's right, we didn't have Nuln oil back then. But once I came across a little channel called Miniac, everything changed. I realized that there is much more to this hobby than just a dry brush and washes. Mini painting is an actual skill, and as such, you can improve at it. This forced me to explore the rabbit hole of mini painting tutorials, and I finally realized how much I didn't know. So the first step is to close the knowledge gap. Painting a mini for the first time? Research. Wanna paint better edge highlights? Research. Wanna get crazy gains? Research. But closing the knowledge gap alone is not enough to get us from this result to a neatly painted mini like this. For that, you need to cross another milestone, and this one is sort of independent of the first one. For me, that happened like 1 or 2 years before I started YouTube, when army painting was all that I cared about. At the time, I decided to paint like 60 white Space Marines, and mind you, those are not the same Space Marines which I absolutely destroyed, annihilated, I f***ed up, and obliterated in one of my videos. These guys took me months to finish, and while there is much faster and convenient way to paint, I took the longer path and suffered. This, however, taught me a valuable skill. You see, every single edge was highlighted and every recess was shaded. And because they are white, and working with whites is a pain in the dick, it took me around 20 hours per miniature. If you repeat something for so long and so many times, it's inevitable that you'll get really good. And by that, I don't mean painting as a whole, but specifically brush skills. I didn't take any shortcuts by using dry brushing or washes. Well, I did use Ager's Earthshade, but I could have as well used thin brown paint. And because everything was shaded and highlighted manually, it forced me to become really precise. Aside from my motor skills improving, I also learned how to thin down my paint for various applications, to have the best control over my brushstrokes. And don't get me wrong, investing 20 hours per miniature for an army is wild. But by putting dry brushing and washes aside and repeating the same steps over and over again, your brush control will get better as a result. So like, yes, dry brushing and washes are still useful, but they don't really force you to be as precise as if you have done it manually. And therefore, you don't get enough reps to improve. And if you indeed cross the knowledge gap and get good with your brush, including paint thinning and all that, achieving something like this should be possible. This, however, will be further solidified in the next level. Let's have another look at all three miniatures next to each other. If you possess the knowledge and the brush skills, what is the difference now? Well, I wanted to edge you for a little longer, but simply speaking, the latter two minis are more clean and defined. If you want to achieve cleanliness on your miniatures, it's simply a matter of being very deliberate with your paint application. No unnecessary brushstrokes visible, to a certain extent a smooth finish, but it can also be textured, that's fine, it just depends on what you're painting at the moment. Oh, and you see this mini right here? Well, I have multiple tutorials on it on Patreon, so if you want to learn how to paint like this, check it out, there will be a link in the description. But arguably, what is even more important than cleanliness is definition. Again, looking at our three incubi models, the first one is way less defined than the other two. The lines have various thickness, the paint is overspilled at some spots, and overall, it's like looking at a YouTube video at 240p. The middle one represents a significant upgrade. The highlights are sharper, details are more distinguishable, so it's like 1080p resolution. The final mini is doing the same thing, turned up a few notches, so like 4K resolution. If you have a mini that is very clean and defined, well, congratulations, you have achieved high refinement. However, this doesn't stop here, because you can be very neat and precise and do everything right on paper, but unless you integrate something else, everything will look kinda flat. This is where the biggest jump in quality will happen for most people. You see, I started on GW minis and the box art was always the thing I looked up to. And I still do like it, but if you do everything to make your minis look similar, they're gonna be flatter than my wallet after a visit at the Warhammer store. So to make your minis more interesting, we gotta add shading. And no, I don't really mean blacklining, I mean actually painting shadows and reflections. Now, box art does this to a certain degree, like on this cloth for example, but when you look at all the Space Marines, they have just a flat armor. Instead of relying on the natural light to do the work for you, which is actually the approach that statue painters use, you can do all the shading yourself. There are many videos on this topic on my channel, but basically it's about using 2D techniques on a 3D medium, which in this case is your miniature. So whatever you're painting, you can actually define the entire shape by painting its volume. Doesn't matter if it's the skin, the armor, or even the metallics, you can paint the reflections and the shades yourself. Funnily enough, if you didn't get into this hobby through Warhammer and maybe you started on busts or larger scale models, you might wanna bitch slap me for even mentioning that, because it's so obvious. Well, for me it wasn't, and I truly think that for many people who did start on Warhammer, this will be the big jump forward. Comparing the middle incubi to the newest iteration, the shading is immediately obvious. Just look at all the panels and how the reflections work on different shapes. The older incubus doesn't really have that, so he is just flat. And while this is the biggest change, there is one more milestone where the possibilities are truly endless. So far, we only talked about stuff on a technical level, learning the skills, achieving refinement, painting volumes and shading, and these are the things that we can objectively recognize on our models. But to take our minis and elevate them from plastic toy soldiers to artistic pieces, we gotta add something else. I call this milestone creativity. And I know it sounds ambiguous as fuck, but for a good reason. These are all the things that go beyond the painting method. This level includes everything that's subjective in our painting, like the color composition, actual physical composition, storytelling, ambience, and so on. To a certain degree, you can always tap into this, and people frequently do, even within army painting, when thinking about the color scheme. Even within the third incubi, there is color theory involved. The intent is to have three major colors on this piece: green, orange, and purple, which together form a triadic color harmony, which makes for a pleasant view. You can also use storytelling if you choose to do that, of course. That depends on what you're trying to do with your minis. Keep in mind that on this level it gets way more subjective. But also, I would say that these soft features are enough to push your miniature painting from a craft to actual art. I mention all of these milestones in this order because that's what my progression looked like. Of course, there is gonna be some crossover and overlap, but if your painting journey looks anything similar like mine, I think that this makes sense. Like, I wouldn't tell a person that has no idea where to even begin to work on their brush skills. Or if you don't know how to thin your paints, you probably have bigger problems on your hands rather than composition. So again, this makes sense to me, but like, for example, if you tell yourself, "F it, I don't want refinement, I wanna be messy," and you skip this one and go straight to these two, I won't stop you. Anyway, if you are anywhere on this painting journey, I still think that the biggest jump in quality will happen right here, when you start painting volumes and defining the shapes. So if you want to learn that, check out this video, because that will give you better ideas on how to approach it. And see you there!